Catherine, welcome everybody, and I hope it's as beautiful a morning with you as it is here in Orkney. Very much looking forward to the second day of this exciting and fascinating conference, which certainly seems to be packing plenty into the programme, I would have to say. I think we'll all be well nourished intellectually by the end of this. Now, in this session, we're going to have two speakers. The keynote 3 here. We're going to have Mark Elliot, followed by Simon Burton, and then hopefully it's time for some questions. So we'll begin with Mark. And Mark is at the present time, he's a Professor of Biblical and Historical Theology here at the University of the Highlands and Islands, based, of course, at Highland Theological College. But he combines this, if that wasn't enough, with a half-time position as Professorial Fellow at Wycliffe College, the University of Toronto. But he didn't start off doing theology. He started off reading law at Oxford, at St John's College, Oxford. Then he studied divinity at Aberdeen and gained his PhD in patristics at Cambridge. He then taught at the Universities of Nottingham, Liverpool Hope and St Andrews, then Glasgow University, and now we're delighted that he's here with us at UHI. His recent projects include The History of Scottish Theology, co-edited with David Ferguson, published by the Oxford University Press in 2019, and Psalms 42 to 72, which is published by Bloomsbury in 2023. He has been co-chair of the History of Interpretation section at the annual meeting of the Society for Biblical Literature, and is currently editor of the More Siebeck series, History of Biblical Exegesis. And he was elected to the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2023. So take it away, Mark.
Donna, could I ask you a favour and you introduce Simon as well? Because Simon's actually going to go first. Sorry about that. We
sorry.
And so if you could introduce us both, that would get us out of the way, sort of sense, and we'll go seamlessly if we can. Is that possible? Sorry about that.
Well, I think I can just about cope with that, indeed, Mark. Apologies, Simon. I was under the impression that Mark was going first. Apologies. So Simon Burton is currently the John Lang Senior Lecturer in Reformation History at the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. He's the author of The Hallowing of Logic, the Trinitarian Method of Richard Baxter's Methodist Theologiae, which came out in 2012 by Brill, and Ramism and the Reformation of Method, the Franciscan Legacy in Early Modernity, which Oxford University Press 2024. He's published widely on late medieval and Reformation early modern theology and co-edited 3 books in this area. He's also the editor of the journal Reformation and Renaissance Review and on the editorial board for the Brepols book series Intellectual Practice and Thought at late medieval and early modern universities. His research focuses on the long Reformation, especially the relation between medieval and Reformed theology, Franciscanism, and the wider movements of Christian Platonism and mysticism. He also has a strong interest in the history of Scottish theology and is currently engaged in research relating to the philosophy and theology of the Scottish Renaissance, which is actually my own area as well. So I'm very much looking forward to that. So I will now change my phrase there and say, take it away, Simon.
Thank you, Donna, so much. And thank you, Catherine and Andrew, and of course, Mark, for the invitation. And it's been really lovely to be here, and it's given me a kind of fresh perspective on my own period. Mark and I don't have a PowerPoint, but I've chosen the famous image of Pope Pius II meeting James I of Scotland as a kind of appropriate background. In their impassioned 2009 article for keynote in Aberdeen, The Continuing Problem of the Scottish Renaissance, Jane Stevenson and Peter Davison make a plea for the reconsideration of the Scottish Renaissance. Writing in a scholarly context in which the Scottish Renaissance has generally been seen as a shallow and derivative affair, entirely overshadowed by the literary glories of the English Renaissance, they mount a stout defence of its importance and distinctiveness. Marshalling an important range of evidence, above all the deep engagement in early Aberdeen with Marsilio Ficino, the article reveals the fascinating connections linking Scotland, Florence, and Italy at the turn of the 16th century. The article brilliantly reveals one very important side of the Scottish Renaissance. Yet as a whole wave of scholarship has revealed, the expansive category of Northern Renaissance is important in explaining not only the reception of the Italian Renaissance north of the Alps, but also its transformation through interaction with native Neoplatonic mystical and devotional currents, shaping a profound Christian humanism as well as a reinvigorated reforming scholasticism. For our purposes today, this is especially relevant, for theology played a pivotal role in this Northern Renaissance. Indeed, while theology's role in the Italian Renaissance has only recently begun to be properly appreciated, the Northern Renaissance has long been known to be animated by profound theological concerns. The Northern Renaissance undoubtedly shared a common desire for a rebirth of Christian civilization with its Italian cousin. But to a greater extent, it drew deeply on medieval as well as ancient and classical sources of inspiration, especially traditions of medieval Platonism. In particular, as we'll see, the Northern Renaissance became deeply enmeshed in the debate between rival nominalist and realist schools, which was rending European scholasticism in the 15th century. The roots of this quarrel concerned the existence of so-called universals or common natures, such as human nature, humanity, or whiteness, something affirmed by realists and denied by nominalists. But it quickly escalated into major philosophical and theological debate, with realists generally espousing a Neoplatonic and participatory view of reality, and nominalists instead emphasizing divine will and covenant as the bond of reality. Significantly, the debate had important repercussions on church and society, not least the burning issues of papalism and conciliarism, the debate over the supreme authority of the Pope or the Council, dividing the late medieval church. Now, it's much too simplistic to equate the Northern Renaissance with one or other of these rival schools. Rather, the creative tension between the schools and the humanist attempts to forge new paths away from scholastic Aristotelianism helped to energize new solutions to the deep philosophical and theological impasse that European Christians felt themselves to be in. We see this, for example, in the new flowering of Neoplatonic and mystical theologies in the northern schools and universities, or in new biblical and covenantal approaches to theology seeking to transcend the speculative scholasticism of the earlier Middle Ages. As classical influences increasingly made themselves felt due to the influence of the Italian Renaissance, they became assimilated into this stream. The deep-felt desire for reform of the church and the renewal of piety animated the Northern Renaissance, ultimately shaping both Catholic and Protestant reformations. For our purposes, in the 15th and 16th century Scottish context, it aligned particularly closely with conciliarist attempts to reform the church through the means of the General Council. So the narrative of Renaissance, which is now unfolding, enriched by theological scholarship, is therefore one of multiple Renaissances emerging in multiple centres and seeding and cross-pollinating each other, something which importantly parallels the now familiar story of multiple reformations. But the place of Scotland in this story, or part of this story, still remains to be written. In particular, while it's now increasingly acknowledged that 15th and 16th century Scotland did in fact see a definite flowering of Renaissance culture, as witnessed by multiple studies in literature, music, art, and architecture, which I'm sure we're familiar with, the significance of this and its connection to wider European currents remains heavily contested. While interest in Scottish theology has seen a recent revival, especially with the landmark History of Scottish Theology co-edited by Mark, most accounts still tend to downplay the Catholic past and fixate on post-Protestant developments, severing the Reformation from its Renaissance roots. The result is a significant gap in our understanding of Scottish life and culture at a time when Scots could often be found at the vanguard of intellectual developments in Europe. The task of re-evaluating the theology of the Scottish Renaissance and its place in the wider Northern Renaissance is obviously a huge one. It's also one often felt to be simply impossible due to the loss of so much material, theological and philosophical material at the Reformation. While it's undoubtedly true that much has been lost, this combined paper takes a more optimistic stance, pointing towards new sources and new avenues of inquiry. Together, Mark and I will focus on three key figures who had a major impact on Scottish Renaissance theology and who embody the currents that shaped it: Bishop Thomas Livingstone, John Ireland, and the famous John Mair. Significantly, they also serve to connect these Scottish developments to the intellectual and theological movements of reform, reshaping European church and society over the course of the long 15th century. My focus, hence the reason for going first, will be on Neoplatonism and Consillarism in Livingstone and Ireland and its connection with the Northern Renaissance. Mark will focus on John Mayer and his relation to wider biblical and humanist currents of reform on the eve of the Reformation. So Livingstone. Thomas Livingstone was one of the most important Scottish reformers of the 15th century and a leading conciliarist. However, given his important role in both the Council of Basel and 15th century reform more widely, Livingstone has been surprisingly neglected. Indeed, apart from discussion by James Burns and Morishami Watanabe, he seems to have been scarcely noticed. Certainly, he's been considerably eclipsed by other Basel conciliarists, especially his friend and rival Nicholas of Cusa, the celebrated German Neoplatonic philosopher and theologian, whose works profoundly shaped both the Northern and Italian Renaissances of the 15th century. Yet Livingstone is deserving of attention in his own right, and not just as a friend of Cusa. Moreover, his educational background, as we'll see, typified that of many Scots of his day, opening a unique window onto the kind of philosophical and theological currents shaping the Scottish universities in their formative century. A rich corpus of Livingstone's work actually survives, including perhaps the only extant sermons preached by a Scot in the 15th century, although if anyone knows of any, please tell us. And recently, William Highland of St Andrews and I have begun to prepare an edition of these with the aim of making his thought more accessible and also casting a light on some of these wider currents. And I'd like to say Bill is here today, and I'm very indebted to him for the transcriptions and translations that I'll draw upon. Born in 1391 into the powerful Livingstone dynasty, Thomas followed the route of so many younger or illegitimate sons and entered the church. He was in the first class at St Andrews and subsequently taught at the university. Significantly, Livingstone came to St Andrews at a time when Scottish scholasticism, mirroring European developments, has splintered into rival opposing schools. In particular, early St Andrews was dominated by the nominalist Lawrence of Lindores, who did his best to suppress realism. Lindores was particularly opposed to Albertism, a realist school tracing its origins to the 13th century Dominican Albert the Great, a man most famous for teaching Thomas Aquinas. Albertism was marked by a Neoplatonic and mystical understanding of the emanation from and return of all things to the divine light of God. In 1418, Lindores succeeded in banning Albertism from St Andrews. Now, we can't be certain that Livingstone adhered to Albertism this early on, but his choice to move to Cologne in 1423 is suggestive. For Cologne, as is well known, was the preferred destination of Scottish Albertists at this time, and Livingstone joined a mini exodus of masters away from the sway of Lindores. Now, he arrived at Cologne at a propitious time, for it was here that the leading Albertist Heinrich de Campo taught a crowd of eager students. In 1426, the young Nicholas of Cusa arrived in Cologne and became an intimate of Heinrich's circle, and it's likely that he and Livingstone met here for the first time. With its Neoplatonic, mystical, and idealist edge, Albertism proved deeply attractive to those like Cusa and Heinrich who desired the reform of the church. Although earlier conciliarists had tended to be nominalist, including in St Andrews, Anthony Black has traced an important strand of realist conciliarism at Cologne, which came to the fore at Basel. Espousing a hierarchical view of reality typical of Neoplatonism, the Cologne Circle elevated the authority of the Church as infallible, subordinating all other authorities, including that of the fallible Pope, to that of the Universal Council of the Church. Of this view, Livingstone was a convinced proponent, holding that the Universal Council as the most sacred synod of synods was entirely infallible in matters of faith. And so it's no surprise that he followed his Cologne friends, including many fellow Scots, to the Council of Basel. Now, Livingstone's early prominence at Basel is seen in the council asking him to preach the Epiphany sermon Venit Lumen in 1433, early on. Revealing his Albertist colours, Livingstone opened the sermon with a lengthy metaphysical preface on the nature of light, a favourite subject of Heinrich and Cusa and Albertists in general. For Livingstone, it's the divine light which creates, vivifies, and beautifies all things through the emanation of the rays of divine goodness. This same divine light illuminates the human mind, enabling it to know the truth. Paralleling the Neoplatonic notion of the cyclical emanation and return of all things, Livingstone argues that the ultimate goal of reality is a conversion of all things to the beautifying light of God. Facing a corrupt church and a decadent papacy, it's the role of the divinely illuminated Council of Basel to orchestrate this return. Indeed, like Heinrich, he saw the council as actually mirroring the ideal heavenly church of the Book of Revelation, and hoped it would inaugurate the eschatological climax of history, seemingly ushering the second coming of Christ. A hope for the imminent resurrection of the dead church, also seen in the contemporary Basel works of his friend Cusa. Tracing out an Albertist itinerary, the sermon culminates with an ascent to deifying union with God, a common theme again of the Albertists. Now, if Livingstone's views can be seen as a tool typical of the powerful Scottish conciliarist party, they throw new light on the mystical and reforming impulses shaping Scottish piety in the 15th century. In the following years, Livingstone found himself on the opposite side from Heinrich and Cusa, as most of the Cologne circle defected from moderate conciliarism to papalism. By contrast, Livingstone remained an ardent conciliarist, becoming a stalwart supporter of the Basel antipope Felix V. Appointed a bishop, he played a fundamental role in the campaign to win the Holy Roman Empire to the council, facing off against his old friend Cusa a number of times at imperial diets. It seems likely as well he had close contact with Scotland at the time, urging the conciliarist party on the country. After the defeat of conciliarism, Livingstone was allowed to retain his episcopal title and threw his energies into reform of the church. Despite the bitter words spoken by both men, he actually reconciled with Cusa, now a cardinal, and served tirelessly as his secretary, accompanying him on the famous Reform Riser of 1451-2, an extraordinary journey through Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, which has been called the most important attempt to reform the German church before Luther. Livingstone also continued to play an important role in Scotland, becoming an advisor to King James II and a leading ecclesiastic up to his death in 1460. Now, like his friend Cusa, Livingstone was truly a child of the Northern Renaissance. In particular, he clearly imbibed the Albertism and Neoplatonism characteristic of Cologne and Leuven, and which is known to have influenced the founding of St. Salvator's and the University of Glasgow as rivals to the nominalism of Lindores. From the evidence of the well-known Copiale Sancti Andreae, the letter book of Prior Haldeston of St. Andrews, Livingstone's sermons are known to have been read and eagerly received in his native land. His close connection with Cusa is both fascinating and elusive, and was not, in fact, the only Scottish link to the eminent German. It's notable, for example, that Bishop William Elphinston, the founder of the University of Aberdeen and a prominent canon lawyer, was later called a second Cusanus, suggesting that the cardinal's legacy was remembered and deeply appreciated in Scotland. Even more significant is Cusa's direct connection with Princess Eleanor Stuart, the Archduchess of Austria, an important patroness of humanists and artists, and a translator in her own right. Letters exist between the cardinal and the Archduchess, showing the attempts of the latter to mediate Cusa's turbulent dispute with her husband, Archduke Sigismund, and her potential support for Cusa's reform endeavours. No direct link with Livingstone is currently known, but may surely be suspected. In any case, it provides one more snapshot into a world in which Scots were often at the forefront of the Northern Renaissance. If Livingstone signifies an early stage of the Northern Renaissance, in which connections with German and Dutch universities were especially prominent, then John Ireland is an important reminder of the continuing importance of the Old Alliance. As a leading Parisian nominalist, he marks a shift away from the realism of an earlier generation, although not the Neoplatonism, as we'll see. Compared to Livingston, Ireland is much better known, has been the subject of important studies by James Burns, Roger Mason, Alexander Brodie, and others, and he's particularly celebrated as the author of the Mirror of Wisdom, a catechism and mirror of princes he wrote for King James III and IV and their courts. This 1490 work has been called the earliest extant work of original Scots prose and has attracted the attention of literary scholars for its connections to Chaucer and wider currents of Scottish and English humanism. It's also an important vernacular theological work showing especially how scholastic and conciliarist concerns impacted on a much wider field. Now, Ireland was born around 1435 in the midst of the Council of Basel. He received his early training as a scholastic philosopher at the Faculty of Arts in St Andrews, where he matriculated in 1455. We know very little about his time there, but he does tell us of an encounter between himself and an elderly Bishop Livingston, a kind of passing on of the conciliarist baton from one generation to the next. Certainly, Ireland's mirror reveals his own committed conciliarism, although connected to the Parisian nominalist school. But as we'll see, there are some intriguing possible links with the Cologne circle as well. In 1458, Ireland moved to Paris, where he quickly rose through the ranks, becoming chaplain to the German nation and serving as the rector of the university. He was a leading nominalist professor. He actually opposed the royal ban on nominalism, so he was one of the chief figures in Paris at the time. And it was at this time, around 1481, that he compiled his important commentary on Peter Lombard's Sentences, the main textbook for medieval theologians. And in this, we see his definite attraction to nominalism, but we also see his connection to the realist school of the Scottish Franciscan John Duns Scotus. Indeed, like Mayor, Ireland was very proud of Scotus, referring to him as the Doctor Subtilis that was a great clerk of Paris and born of this land. From the 1470s onwards, Ireland was closely involved in diplomatic work for Louis XI and came to the attention of James III, who invited him to Scotland to serve as his chaplain and confessor. From this time on, he became closely involved in the complex web of politics, apparently earning the enmity especially of Archbishop William Chevers. Although he grieved the death of his royal master at Sockieburn in 1488, it did not prevent him from continuing as chaplain and confessor, at least for a time, to James IV. But his influence definitely waned, and he lived out his life as a simple priest in the borders. Now, the 7 books of the Mirror are those in which Ireland provided what he called the ABC of Christianity, as well as a remarkable apologetic defense of Christianity in the heart of the book. Now, James IV seems to have politely ignored this, but for us, it provides a unique vantage point on Scottish theological culture at the end of the 15th century. Now, much of the scholastic argumentation in the Mirror is characterized by this kind of nominalist Scotist fusion characteristic of Paris in the later 15th century. Of greater significance for us today, though, is Ireland's engagement with the Theologia Naturalis of Ramon de Sebond, a book that was later placed on the Index of Prohibited Books for its controversial claim to be able to prove the mysteries of the Christian faith through reason alone. Now, interestingly, Ireland draws tacitly on Sebond, and in this we see some rehearsals of important Renaissance themes of the dignity of man and of human nature as a kind of metaphysical measure of raw reality. But Sebond was also an exponent of a method called Lullism, a method that went back to the 13th century Franciscan Ramon Lull, and which claimed to have a kind of encyclopedic key to all reality, and indeed, using the divine attributes, developed a method of proving the Christian faith, which is hence Ireland's reason for his interest. Now, this is interesting because Lullism, often fused with Albertism in the 15th century, is known to have been extremely popular in Cologne with Heinrich and Nicholas of Cusa. It was also very popular in Paris, and just a few years after Ireland completed the Mirror, the famous French reformer Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples whose writings were incredibly popular in Scotland in the 16th century, actually took up Lullism into his own evangelical and Christocentric kind of program of reform. So this presence of Lullism in Ireland's mirror connects him not only to an earlier tradition of Northern Renaissance deeply rooted in Scotland, but also to the new currents of Christian humanism reshaping the church. Now, while Ireland and his mirror are both well known, the question of his subsequent influence has scarcely been broached. Ironically, we find some indication in his enemy, Archbishop Chevez, who's been called a true Scottish Renaissance man. As is well known, Chevez has a rich trove of books surviving, and in some of these books there seem to be his own annotations referring to issues such as Albertism and Sabond and other issues that may have been triggered by Ireland. We also know that Bishop Elphinston knew Ireland in Paris and actually gave the copy of Ireland's sentences commentary to his colleague Hector Boyce, and it may well have been used in early teaching at the University of Aberdeen. So more study is needed of some of the marginalia and annotations to see if we can detect that. One burning question which must be considered is whether Mayer and his circle had any access to Ireland's works. Mayer arrived in Paris only a decade after the repeal of the ban on nominalism, and as a leading nominalist and a leading Scot, it seems unthinkable he would not have known of Ireland. His own theology, as well, here has that kind of Scoto-nominalist fusion, and so we need some more study of Ireland's sentences commentary, and also especially of Mayer. And very happily, our friend and colleague Giovanni Gilera has a massive new project in Geneva on John Mayer, so we hope for good results for that. But for more on Mayer, and especially his neglected biblical exegesis, I now turn over to Mark.
Thank you, Simon. I know that for many of you, this might seem like something completely different from another planet, as it were. And while I myself have been educated incredibly in the last half hour, still trying to digest some of it, that would leads me to perhaps think that what I'm going to give you now is a case study of John Mayer, but I'm going to try and do that quite lightly, so I won't give you every detail that one could perhaps have about Mayer and his fascinating personality that he was, but just to kind of give you a kind of an outline. So there'll be a little bit of time for questions, make sure that does happen. Now, John Mayer was born in Haddington, 1467. He was educated at Cambridge for 1 year. Then he turned up in Paris, probably around about 1492-93, and was educated at the Collège Saint-Barbe, and then he was tutored at Collège Navarre, so he had a kind of arts education to begin with. And then around about 1496, he entered the College of Montague to study theology with the Flemish doctor. Again, interesting Flemish presence there, Jean Standonck, and also the French divine Noel Beda. Beda was Standonck's successor as a principal of the College of Montague, the kind of leading kind of new theological college of that time. At that same time, in the mid-1490s, Erasmus was there too, and also the Dundonian, soon to be principal of King's College Aberdeen, Hector Boyce, who we just heard of. He was there too. At 40 years of age, Mayer received his doctorate, and the following year, 1508, he was in London preaching at Paul's Cross for his friend, the Neoplatonist influenced Dean of St. Paul's, Jean Collet. And he actually was preaching, interestingly, against superstitious abuses that were taking place at the Marian shrines in England. John Durkin tells us that John Mayer was one of the first to opine on issues arising out of the Spanish conquest of the Americas. So Mayer was no mere theorist. And prior to De las Casas, would disagree with the idea that natives had no right to govern themselves. He would disagree with Las Casas, so he had a fairly conservative position on that, but at least he had a position on it. He was interested in the question, which De las Casas would open up and say, yes, the natives do have a right to govern themselves. Mayer wasn't so sure, but he was at least interested in the question of the New World. Yet Mayer was not so remote from real life of his own that he couldn't be well acquainted with things in the old world. One of the interesting things in the lectures on Aristotle's physics is that Mayer makes a reference to a very recent earthquake in Paisley. And Mayer also did have pastoral duties of his own. So philosophy, increasingly with an interest in ethics, was important for the defense of Christian truth, and it should not be abandoned by younger scholars with their fashionable rhetoric. One might think that for me, it's very important that theology, philosophy, moral theology have a reference to the real world and not just be a kind of a language game that scholars play. Mayer certainly dealt with practical and moral issues that had also occupied the canon lawyers in recent centuries, issues of sex, economics, and procedure in various treatises, as well as devoting a large commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is his last known work, a huge work dating from 1530. In terms of his views, for example, on usury, what mattered for Mayer was not so much the virtue of the individual person either lending or borrowing money, but what mattered was that moral order be kept in society, and society would flourish and not be carried away too much by greed or self-interest. In contrasting him with the more conservative Cardinal Cajetan, who was a rough contemporary of Mayer, Doherty has suggested that, for example, Mayer was more liberal on certain things. He accepted adultery as a sound reason for divorce, and he did not believe that procreation was the only reason for getting married. Mayer was also a defender of the notion of the infinite in action, which bears some resemblance avant la lettre to Pascal. As Alexander Brodie has told us, he was very interested, particularly in his early days, in questions of logic. But he was also a historian, and perhaps he's most famous to most of us for his history of Greater Britain, as he puts it, which might give you some indication of his, well, unionism would be an anachronism, but you know what I mean, as well as marking his territory as a theologian with a commentary on Lombard's sentences. And last but not least, he was a commentator on the Bible, the four Gospels particularly. Veritably then a Renaissance man in more ways than one. But Mayer was also very northern in the sense that as a conciliarist, Rome was not the be-all and end-all. What Rome believed, what Rome taught, and opined was not the first and last word on matters. He also thought that national kingship for each nation had enough of the sacred about it to be able to give some guidance to the national church. Now, St Andrews University, I think that's a case in point, had been founded by a pope at Avignon, who was technically schismatic. But that didn't matter because who the Pope or where the Pope lives or what the Pope is not as important as the council that recognized St Andrews. And so in some sense, there was no absolutizing of Roman authority. Mayer was a conciliarist, a convinced conciliarist, and even in 1512 was charged with proposing some conciliarist theories and theses for discussion at the Fifth Lateran Council, only to be disappointed when most of his ideas were dismissed, and the council came out with a very much a papalist line that the Pope is the one who makes the decisions ultimately, and who in some sense embodies the indefectibility, if not the infallibility, of the Church. Mayer's own student, Almain, came into conflict with Cajetan on this very question. Cajetan being a papalist and steeped in canon law, who seemed to think of the council, any council that met, was called as merely the Pope's sounding board. We could talk about other sort of parallel things going on in Aberdeen, but I'll skip that. But just to say that they were going on, and if you want to say that what's going on in the Scottish Renaissance is a Northern Renaissance, well, that's perhaps even more the case with Aberdeen. But these people are therefore the founders of Aberdeen University, and people like Mayer, who was associated with Glasgow and St Andrews, as well as being in Paris, were very much people who worked together or knew each other. Mayer's printer, Joseph Bad of Ghent, was also used by Erasmus. Mayer was amongst the theologians in Paris who was requested to evaluate Erasmus's paraphrases on Matthew by the Sorbonne. Mayer was no just like when he even wrote in his sentences, we start to see that although scholastic in training and in education, his humanism led him to perhaps supply some new insights into theological matters. So, for example, on the question from Book 2, Distinction 10 of Peter Lombard's Sentences on whether angels can be sent, he contributes to the discussion a passage from Zechariah 2 that Peter Lombard had no awareness of. So he finds a kind of biblical proof text, and he's able to kind of say, well, this also has a bearing on the matter. And I think this is part of the French biblical Renaissance in the time of around about 1514, where the French king issued a statute that bachelors are to read Nicholas of Lyra's biblical commentary on parts of the Bible after their mealtime. And the biblical text was read before the meals, and the commentary by Lyra was read after the meal. So kind of a real concern that students, whether art students or theology students, should know their Bibles and Lyra's commentary on the Bible. So, and even if Mair can be in some sense labelled as scholastic, it's not to the high medieval doctors he appeals, but actually more often to ones who are closer to himself in date. So, for example, while the above surveys include many authorities who are common to many scholastic writers, what is remarkable about Mair is the multiplicity and diversity of 14th century citations. The very fact that Mair cites such a diverse array of 14th century authors suggests that he viewed 14th century thought as a high point of intellectual productivity. The 14th century wasn't just recent, it was also perhaps, one could say, at least proto-humanist, if one has a particular reading of Occam, Adam Woden, and Gregory of Rimini. Mair himself came to realize that his students were increasingly more interested in the practical topics of Book 4 of the Sentences rather than the more speculatively metaphysical ones of Books 1 and 2 on who God is and the Trinity. They were more interested in the questions of, what does this mean for us, kind of thing. Mair notes that this shift to more of an interest in the questions of salvation, questions of theological anthropology, questions of sacraments, that shift occurred around 1518 when the new heresy of Martin Luther was beginning to threaten the Catholic faith. So the question is more about how does the gospel get applied? What does Christianity mean sort of in practice? Even that move towards the existential can be viewed as some kind of humanist movement. The telos of loving God makes theology a practical discipline. And even contemplation of God is practical in Mair's understanding of that. So accordingly, Mair's own philosophical emphasis on the human ability to respond to divine initiative, he very much promoted the idea that humans had some amount of free will to be able to respond to divine grace, is something one can see in sort of in terms of a theology of renewal of human beings accepting the grace of God, but then kind of using it and putting into some kind of service and sort of digesting it and harnessing it. Well, Simon has already mentioned Mair's conciliarism, and what is interesting is that Mair, as a conciliarist, very much believed that councils were there in order to try to renew the church or to check the church where it was imbalanced or corrupt. And as I said already, he had high hopes for the Fifth Lateran Council, only to be disappointed. And perhaps this first Matthew commentary, he tries our commentary on Matthew in 1518 on Matthew's Gospel, and that's the first kind of Gospels commentary he does. And it seems to be an assertion of conciliarist theory over against papalist theory. It's like one last attempt to sort of show that conciliarism is right and how important councils are to the church. This new paradigm is coming from the north. We see it in a strange form, perhaps, but nevertheless, we see it in Luther's Wittenberg. We see it more directly from Antwerp and Ostend, as would become clearer when material evidence of the smuggled copies of Tyndale's English New Testament would be the external evidence that witnessed to an inner belief in justification by faith alone. So when people are caught and are burned for their beliefs in Scotland in the late 1520s and into the 1530s, Patrick Hamilton being the most obvious one, they are accused of believing in justification by faith alone, which is a heresy. But the evidence is that they happen to have Tyndale's New Testament, a translation from Erasmus's Greek, in their possession. So humanism and reform going together. Now, for Mair, Mair was aware that even Paris was changing shape, and that was partly because the Sorbonne's hegemony had come into question by some of the smaller colleges and also by the Collège de France, founded as it was about to be founded by Francis I in 1530. But it was this kind of movement away from the dominance of the Sorbonne, even in Paris. And Paris wasn't the only show in town anymore. It was being challenged by Leuven as a significant kind of northern theological centre. And we know that those two most famous Protestant martyrs, Patrick Hamilton and George Wishart, spent time in Leuven before fully coming out for the cause of the Reformation in the mid-late 1520s. But of course, by the 1530s and 1540s, that had spread more widely to Marburg, Wittenberg, Frankfurt, and Geneva. I think we can still call most of those somewhat northern. So Mayer, as a humanist considerist, wants to go to the sources. He wants to find the evidence for what he believes in the sources, as Erasmus would have affirmed. Go to the four Gospels. So much is made in studies, not many studies have been done of this, but much has been made of Mayer's debt to Nicholas of Lyra, this very famous biblical commentator on all the Bible from around about 1300. But also that Lyra is very influenced here by Jean Gerson, who was a great kind of granddaddy of the conservative movement. And so in the 1518 commentary on Matthew, when it comes to Matthew 16:18, where Christ says to Peter that on this rock I will build my church. Here, says Mayer, the rock is not Peter, but the rock is Christ himself. And so this is just in some sense of downplaying the authority of Peter and upplaying obviously the authority of Christ, but the church as the body of Christ in some sense is represented by a council. That's where you find out where you get Christ's authority from, consulting representatives of his body, and the Pope is there to do a particular job in that as part of that body. In any case, as he says here in the commentary, the New Testament law always says that law and commandment are always to combine with the idea of liberty and of gentleness, not of hegemony. And so the idea of the Pope having executive authority to tell everybody what to believe and how to believe it is in conflict with the New Testament, which talks of gentleness. Likewise, in the famous Enchiridion of 1503, Erasmus had promoted gentleness, mansuetudo, as the Christ-like virtue. We know of Erasmus's Scottish links with James IV's son, Alexander Stewart, who had studied with the humanists during his sojourn and Erasmus's sojourn in Italy, 1506, 1509, before Alexander Stewart returned to Scotland only to die at Flodden, unfortunately. But certainly what is important is that the church is represented by a general council, which is above the Pope, and in some sense the Pope is really just a functionary. Mayer's credentials as a humanist, if he had to prove the point, are very apparent from his 1529 general preface to his commentary on the four Gospels. He redoes the Matthew 1 and he writes on Mark, Luke, and John as well. He criticizes Valla as one kind of humanist, and he prefers Pico and John Colley as his particular preferred humanists, partly because things like they are the words themselves in a text really matter. Words are not just rhetorical flourish, particularly when it comes to the Gospels. Jesus didn't say anything with no consequence. He chose his words very carefully. So words of Holy Scripture, not least the words of Jesus, are to be understood as not rhetorical in the sense that they can be dispensed with or paraphrased quite wildly into different meaning. One must be attending to the importance of the words and the specific significance of what is meant by Holy Writ. Humanist influence is manifest in the preface to the Luke commentary, which is full of classical references in his laudation of the dedicatee of the commentary, that is Archbishop of Glasgow, Gavin Dunbar, who is described in classical prose as one who, with the armoury of canon law, can take on the pirates on the ocean, that is, the heretics who are attacking the ship of the church. That's the job of the Archbishop, to be the anti-pirateer. There is not only classical imagery and allusion, but also a full classical style in his dedication. In closing, he refers to what Aristotle reported in Book 5 of his Ethics. Obviously, Mayer had been studying this in the late 1520s. And he refers to the figure of Pittacus of Mytilene in a rather elusive way, as one might do when sharing an in-joke with Dunbar. And he quotes just three words: magistratus virum ostendit. The magistrate, the person in charge, shows his power, shows his strength. Dunbar could be tough and needed to be tough. A man who is a ruler must show his force. But Mayer follows this immediately with the observation that his friendliness, this is Dunbar, and his generous humanity are the distinguishing features of the Archbishop. Or to take another, his first redaction of the commentary on Book 1 of Lombard's Sentences, published in 1510, so a little bit before, John Mair presents a playful dialogue between his students David Cranston and Gavin Douglas on the relationship between theology and philosophy, incorporating many of the humanist critiques of the scholastic method, which is voiced by Douglas. Cranston sort of sticks up for scholastic method. Douglas says scholastic method has kind of had its day and needs to be supplemented, if not replaced, by more humanist methods, more interested in original sources, more interested in classical and ancient learning, more interested perhaps in the Bible than in medieval scholastic thought. And Mair never kind of corrects Douglas's humanist critiques of the scholastic system. In terms of what explains his turning to the four Gospels, we've already mentioned that he feels that the four Gospels are certainly to begin with Matthew's Gospel, but then increasingly the four Gospels are how one finds the kind of the real truth of the matter by going back to the sources. But kind of with hindsight in 1528, in his dedication, this is a dedication to his Sentences commentary, he says, some 10 years ago, this is 1528, some 10 years ago, a great army of pestilential heretics, having made themselves a covering out of the bark of scriptures, brought in all sorts of abominable ravings. With this good result, however, for the Lord wishes by the vices of some to teach proper behaviour to all, that professors of theology began really to get to work on the sacred scripture and its explanation, and to put aside their other interests. Thus, the biblical theological efforts of Luther and company had forced Mair and others to become a biblical scholar himself and write a commentary on all four Gospels, not unlike Cardinal Cajetan, who kind of went into semi-retirement after his confrontation with Luther and ended up writing commentary on the whole Bible. Some of it's, better quality than other parts of it. Both Cajetan and Mair could be said to be medieval in their approach to dogmatic theological exegesis, always wanting to find Christian doctrine in every text of the Bible. But on the other hand, both Mair and Cajetan stood at the headwater of an increasingly textually competent Catholic biblical scholarship of the coming century. Scripture did contain mysteries. It wasn't as clear-cut that one could just read off Scripture, Christian doctrine, and that was the end of it. If you say that Scripture is there to correct the church, then every heretic will have the right to support his wandering paradoxes as he wishes, as we see at this time. So what Mair is saying is that Scripture is not as clear and as easy as the reformers and the heretics think. It's mysterious. It needs hard work. It needs the church's tradition of interpretation to make it understandable. You cannot do without that. You cannot just read Scripture neat and expect to have the truth. That way lies heresy and ravings, as he puts it. So I'm running out of time, and therefore I want to kind of come to a conclusion pretty quickly. I just wanted to say about his what I've been working on a little bit is his approach to his work on Luke's Gospel, his commentary on Luke's Gospel. Now, on the one hand, you might expect Luke's Gospel as most sort of inclusive sounding of all the Gospels, where it's about the salvation not just of Jews, but kind of implied of Gentiles as well, and a kind of an openness to the human race beyond the kind of the confines of Israel. You might be disappointed sometimes with Mair's interpretation of Luke's Gospel, because if you look at Luke 22, 14 to 38, which is the account of the conversations that went on at the Last Supper, John Mair ends in commentating on this by saying that not even Mary, the Mother of God, was allowed to come to that Last Supper. She's not one of the apostles, and in some sense, she is. That's simply because she's a woman. Now, you might think that Mair shares with John Knox, who was his student in Paris, we believe, a strong misogyny, and you probably wouldn't be wrong in thinking that. But when we look a little bit closer in his explanation, Mair, I think, it's not so much a question of gender, but a question of sex. That there was a strong understanding that on the altar, there could be no place for anyone who was going to be liable to bring any kind of uncleanness into that space. And so a very kind of Old Testament, but nevertheless, in some quarters, medieval understanding of. I don't have time to go into all the details of that, but certainly the priesthood is elevated to be something which is kind of beyond sort of human functions. And in order that the Eucharist that gets celebrated there can be sort of kept safe, as it were, from any pollution. Priests who consecrate the body of Christ are to be segregated from lay people, whether male or female. And that priestly dignity is taught even by Aristotle, who Hippodamus of Milesius, before Aristotle's Politics 2:6, taught a tripart society where the sacred takes precedence over the public and the private. And he goes through various biblical kind of texts to show that the priesthood has always been sacred and always been set apart. Whereas Luther is summoning monks and nuns from all their priories to mix together, to take off their cowls, to kind of live freely and not to regard priesthood as anything special, the priesthood of all believers and all that. These people, he says, are just basically people who follow their own noses and their own desires, whereas true priests have had a ascetical training that has disciplined them. And the result of that is that amongst priests there are never quarrels, just as among the apostles. With the exception of Judas, of course, there was a unity of mind and heart, and not many disagreements at all. However, Mayor does have space for human sin and for forgiveness of that human sin, so an awareness of weakness. And when Jesus says that he's prayed for Peter, well, it seems to be addressing Peter, but I have prayed for you that your faith will not fail. And when you return, remember, Peter's faith fails, the disciples' faith all fails, and they desert Jesus the next day when he's crucified. And Jesus says, you, but Mayor notices that it's you, plural. I prayed for you, all you disciples, that the church, the faith will not fail. But Peter's role is to come back and strengthen his brothers and sisters. So Peter is kind of as the arch sinner, kind of says, the arch betrayer, the person who actually lets Jesus down for having claimed that he would not do so, is the one who is called upon, having sought forgiveness from God, to give forgiveness back to his. And that's the role of the Pope. The Pope is there to be a counselor and to be somebody who consoles and strengthens his church, not somebody who bosses the church as a CEO. Anyway, that's I want to just conclude there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mark and Simon, for some absolutely fascinating papers. I've taken pages of notes here, and I have a lot of questions, but I'll try and restrain myself. I think we have a very short time for questions, and I think folk can either put a question in the chat or they can put a question in the question and answer section as well, or put their hands up. And I see that Lucy Dean's straight off the mark. Take it away, Lucy.
I was the same as you, Donna. I scribbled down so many notes during the course of that. Thank you both for a really interesting paper, and for Simon for picking one of my favourite paintings to have behind you. It's wonderful. I had a question for you actually, Simon, about Livingstone. I know he's known to have defended James I in the papal court in the 1430s, and he's thought to have been one of the ones that persuaded James to let Scots go to the Council of Basel. But I wondered if you knew any more about Livingstone's influence or relationship with James I, because I know he was, or I think he was later a confessor in his older age to James II. So I was just trying to figure out what kind of role he might have had in close connection with James. My reason for asking is particularly due to the points you made about Albertism and the interest in reform and mysticism, and whether Livingstone might have been influential in James I's choice of founding the Carthusian house at Perth. As the Carthusians are quite well known for their austerity and their connections to mysticism and that sort of thing. So I just wondered if there was a link that's been missed there about that choice that James has. Everyone.
That's fascinating. And as I was kind of looking at this, again, I was thinking about all of those kind of machinations about, consullarism and the visit of Pius II and lots of things that we don't know. I think Bill and I will definitely want to dig into that more. Cusa was very close to Carthusian reformers, and Dennis the Carthusian was said to have been on the Reform Riser. He possibly wasn't, but he was a close friend of Cusa. So the link between Albertism and Carthusianism definitely seems plausible and something worth exploring. And I think past the issues we don't know. I don't think we know, Bill might correct me,